World War II ended, but for millions, it was just the beginning of horror. May 1945. Wwii's end, leaving devastation behind. Germany, the conflict's engine, lay in ruins, its people facing chaos and hunger. But for millions, especially in Eastern Europe, defeat was just the start of a brutal new chapter. Expelled, hunted, and revenged upon, they faced a fate of violence and loss. The ethnic cleansing of Germans wasn't random, it was systematic, affecting men, women, and children alike. From Königsberg's massacres to the endless treks in East Prussia and Silesia, survivors' tales tell of unspeakable pain. Rape, executions, and brutal cold marked their exile. This makes you wonder. Did the war's end bring peace for all? Or did it unleash new horrors? Just how immense was the post-war wave of suffering and destruction? What became of Germany after the war? Sunset of an empire. Germany in rubble, 1945. In May 1945. Germany's unconditional surrender marked the end of World War II. In Europe. However, instead of immediate relief, this historic moment unleashed utter collapse. For the Third Reich and heralded a period of chaos and suffering for the German people. Entire cities were reduced to rubble. Infrastructure destroyed, and millions of civilians displaced or trapped in war zones. The nation that had driven the conflict now faced the consequences of its catastrophic defeat. The Nazi regime's fall wasn't orderly. The weeks leading up to surrender were marked by panic and chaos. Berlin, Germany's political and military heart, became a symbol of its ruin. The final battle for the capital left the city utterly destroyed. Over 80% of buildings were reduced to rubble by Allied bombing. And fierce street fighting between the Red Army and German forces. Photos by Soviet correspondents reveal a nightmare scene. Streets choked with debris, burnt-out buildings, and hollow-eyed civilians. The impact on civilians was devastating. In the war's final months, millions tried to flee combat zones, especially from East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia. Intact families began desperate westward treks, carrying what little they could. Declassified Soviet documents from the 90s record how these refugee columns were often attacked by Allied aircraft and ground troops, leaving hundreds dead. One survivor of these journeys recalled, "It was as if heaven and earth had turned against us. Every step was a risk. Mothers clutched their children, but not all would reach their destination." Simultaneously, within German cities, food shortages and collapsing essential services pushed millions to despair. Bartering became commonplace, with many resorting to desperate measures for necessities. A 1946 International Red Cross report detailed how, in cities like Hamburg and Dresden, civilians traded personal valuables for a slice of bread or meager rations. Hunger wasn't the only enemy. Diseases, worsened by poor sanitation and overcrowding, spread rapidly. Typhus and dysentery outbreaks reached epidemic levels. Overwhelmed and under-equipped hospitals couldn't cope. A doctor working in Berlin after Germany's surrender wrote in his diary, "More and more patients arrive each day. There are women and children who haven't eaten for days. Their bodies can barely fight off a minor infection. We feel helpless." Meanwhile, in occupied zones, treatment of German civilians varied widely. In the east, under Red Army control, civilian reprisals were frequent. Rape, looting, and summary executions became a grim reality for thousands. Although officially unsanctioned, internal NKVD documents reveal they were often tolerated as retribution for Nazi atrocities in Soviet territory. A witness recorded by Polish investigators spoke of a woman in Königsberg who saw neighbors executed, accused of being SS members, without proof. In the West, under American, British, and French administration, policy towards German civilians was more structured. However, living conditions remained harsh. Allied authorities imposed strict controls on movement and local activity, while dismantling the Nazi system. Germans, many mentally broken and physically exhausted, also faced the humiliation of occupation by the powers that defeated their nation. Social chaos was also evident in rising crime. With central authority gone, thefts, assaults, and violence soared. In many cities, Allied forces had to step in to restore order, despite limited resources. A British archive from 1945 mentions that in Hamburg, civilian groups began patrolling to protect their neighborhoods, often armed with whatever they could find. Despite the hardship, the first glimmers of hope appeared. International organizations like the Red Cross and the United Nations stepped in to provide humanitarian aid. Food parcels and medicine sent from abroad saved many lives, though they couldn't meet all needs. Photos from the time show children in Berlin queuing for bread, their faces gaunt, but with a spark of hope as they received hot food. The Third Reich sunset marked the end of a brutal regime, but also the start of prolonged suffering for millions. The physical and mental devastation left by the war created a grim backdrop where survival defined every aspect of daily life. Flucht und Vertreibung, the flight and expulsion of millions. After Germany's 1945 surrender, one of Europe's largest humanitarian crises began. Around 12 to 14 million ethnic Germans were expelled from their homes in Eastern European territories like East Prussia, Silesia, and the Sudetenland. This displacement, known as Flucht und Vertreibung, flight and expulsion, represented one of the largest forced migrations in modern history. Plans for expulsion were already in motion before the war ended, particularly at the Potsdam Conference in July 1945. Allied powers agreed to redraw Europe's borders. An official document from the Allies at Potsdam stated these actions were needed for peace, though acknowledging expulsions must be orderly, humane. But reality was very different. In Soviet-occupied lands, expulsions were brutal, swift. Soviet troops, with local militias, stormed German villages. Families got minimal time to pack before forced removal. A declassified Soviet secret document revealed how Germans were crammed into cattle wagons, designed for livestock, sent west on weeks-long journeys. Conditions were dire: no sanitation, poor ventilation, little food or water. Harsh winter 45 to 46 worsened the refugees' plight. In East Prussia, thousands froze to death on long marches west. Photos from Soviet war correspondents showed endless streams of refugees, including children and the elderly, struggling through snow. Survivors' accounts paint a harrowing picture. Greta M., expelled from Silesia with her family, recalled, "My mother carried my baby brother, I pulled the sledge with our belongings. Sometimes we had to leave things behind just to keep going. The cold was unbearable, but if you stopped, you died." Besides harsh weather, refugees faced violence and abuse on their journey. Often, convoys and groups were attacked by local militias seeking revenge for Nazi atrocities. A 1992 Polish study noted many survivors recall immediately by local militias, accused of collaborating. German women and girls were particularly vulnerable. Reports of mass rape by soldiers and militias emerged frequently in testimonies. A German study in the 1990s revealed at least 2 million women were victims of sexual violence during these expulsions, though many stories were buried. For decades, the revealed accounts show the deep psychological and physical impact these experiences had on survivors. Those who reached Western Germany found no easy life. Refugee camps in the West were overcrowded, lacking resources to cope with the influx. A 1947 International Red Cross report described families in makeshift, cramped tents with dozens more. Illness spread, and malnutrition was rampant among children and elderly. The influx also caused social strain. Locals, already struggling post-war, saw refugees as a burden. Refugees faced stigma and rejection. Bavarian archives from 1946 document a village protest against a refugee camp being built nearby. Yet, the displaced gradually rebuilt lives. Some found work in farming or industry, others seized educational opportunities. But the pain of expulsion left an indelible mark. Memories of lost homes, journey hardships, and struggling in hostile environments. Passed down generations, forming part of expelled Germans' identity. The expulsions, justified then for stability, caused immense suffering. Decades of documentation show how political decisions in conference rooms had devastating human consequences. This chapter of Europe, less known than others of World War II, is a reminder of conflict's deep scars. Explosions, massacres in Königsberg, Breslau, and other cities. The Third Reich's fall in 1945 sparked revenge across Eastern Europe on German civilians. In cities like Königsberg and areas under Nazi control, Soviet troops and local militias conducted bloody reprisals. One of the darkest chapters as the war ended. These massacres, with unchecked violence, arbitrary executions, and abuse, left deep scars. Königsberg, East Prussia's cultural gem, saw brutal transformation. The city was besieged by Soviet troops before falling in April 1945. As Soviet soldiers entered, they found exhausted, starving civilians. But for soldiers who'd suffered Nazi crimes, there was no mercy. Declassified 1992 Soviet documents reveal mass executions of men accused, often without proof, of collaborating with Nazis. A Königsberg survivor, Helgola, recounted in a 1950s interview, men were dragged from homes, lined up. We heard gunfire from windows but could do nothing. It wasn't justice, it was systematic destruction. A Königsberg survivor, Helgola, recounted this in a 1950s interview. Men were dragged from their homes and lined up on the street. We heard gunshots from the windows, but couldn't do a thing. It wasn't justice, it was systematic destruction. War crimes went beyond just executions. Soviet soldiers committed mass rape, a tactic to terrorize women of all ages. In Königsberg, tens of thousands of women were sexually assaulted after the city fell. A lost NKVD document showed these acts, though officially condemned, were often ignored by commanders. The physical and mental scars left a lasting impact on victims. Many never dared speak about their suffering. Breslau, another key city in Silesia, faced a similar fate. For months, it was a brutal battlefield as Germans resisted the Soviet advance. When the city finally surrendered in May 1945, retribution against civilians began immediately. Polish archives, discovered in the 70s, detailed how the Soviet army systematically looted the city, destroying property and executing civilians suspected of Nazi ties. In one of the most shocking accounts, a family sheltering in a church was dragged out and publicly shot. A Polish witness recalled years later, there was uncontrolled rage in the soldiers. They didn't distinguish between guilty and innocent. To them, all Germans were responsible. In both Königsberg and Breslau, reprisals weren't solely by Soviet forces. Local militias, including civilians who'd suffered under Nazi occupation, also took part in the violence. Armed with knives, pistols, and makeshift weapons, these groups carried out public hangings and looting, adding to the chaos. In Königsberg, a 1995 document described a militia burning a German merchant accused of informing on neighbors. In other areas like Nemesdorf, East Prussia, massacres were even larger. Nemesdorf was one of the first German villages taken by the Red Army in October 1944. Witness accounts and German soldier photos showed dozens of civilians, including children and the elderly, executed without trial. While the exact circumstances are debated by historians, evidence shows widespread, deliberate violence. The psychological toll on survivors was devastating. Many, overwhelmed by trauma, remained silent, while others rebuilt amid the ruins. A 1948 report detailed severe depression and anxiety in women gang-raped in Königsberg. Children witnessing executions showed signs of severe PTSD. Despite the scale of these events, official documentation is scarce. Allied powers, focused on post-war stability, downplayed information about massacres and abuses. However, survivor testimonies and declassified documents gradually revealed the true extent of these reprisals. A German archive, found in 1987, listed over 10,000 missing civilians from reprisals in East Prussia. Many were never found. The legacy of these massacres is a grim reminder that war's end didn't bring peace for all. For Germans in Königsberg, Breslau, and other eastern cities, defeat meant a new period of suffering, haunting generations. Collective guilt, the German responsibility doctrine. Post-Wwii policies imposed collective punishment on Germans, based on the idea that the entire nation, to some degree, was responsible for Nazi crimes. This view was supported by the Allies and widely accepted by nations formerly occupied by Germany. From mass expulsions to forced labor and direct retribution, this doctrine shaped post-war policy and left a legacy of suffering for millions. At the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, Allied leaders discussed Germany's fate.